All right, my friends, let's get this one over with, shall we? I have been dreading this discussion. I imagine we all have since I saw the episode. It is always our preference to love the episode we're talking about. It's a lot easier and a lot more fun that way, but sometimes we're not so lucky. And we know we've carved out an awesome little niche in the Handmaid's Tale world. And we also know that we owe it to our listeners who will be reeling right now to be honest about our thoughts and feelings here, as there's been a major change and a major character arc in this episode. The intended, which was Nick's, of course, but even more so for us, June's. Usually, when we are disappointed with the direction the show has taken, we can also try to balance it a bit by focusing positively on the other storylines we have enjoyed in the episode. However, the majority of this episode is devoted to characters piling on Nick, so as a result, the brunt of our discussion will, of course, also be about that. So, what I'm saying is, if you're not a Nick or a Nick and June fan, you probably would not enjoy this discussion, so come back next week, if you want. We know this episode of Handmaids will leave most of our longtime listeners with strong feelings. Sad, anger, whatever it is, we get it. And if you love this episode, good for you. But for the rest of you that didn't, we understand. Having heard countless times how this final season was a love letter for the fans, we know how it feels to suddenly realize they meant for all of the fans except for those of Nick and June. It has helped us immensely after watching this episode to have each other to talk through it with, and I hope we can provide that for those of you that maybe need to hear that you're not crazy. Because I promise you, you are not crazy. And while there will be plenty of genuine emotion from us slipping out during this discussion, that's unavoidable, it's important to us to also present facts to back up why you're not crazy if you're feeling like you're being gaslit by this episode. In 2025 America, we get enough gaslighting from our president to recognize it with ease, and we're apparently not numb to it yet. But before getting down to details, we do have some thoughts on why the show might suddenly be doing this. We don't know anything for sure. But it's long been a fear of some of our group. A few others have stayed incredibly optimistic throughout. But some of our group has wondered if the show has, for some reason, been angered by the attention that Nick and June has drawn and blamed it primarily on Nick. If this is true, that would explain why they've dragged on the very uneven love triangle for 6 whole seasons, tried several different personalities on Luke season after season in the hopes people might quote-unquote switch teams, and why they've piled awful situation after awful situation on Nick in an effort to douse Nick and June's fire and turn this particular fandom off. It even seemed like maybe they were purposefully taking the things we've loved about Nick and June, Hawaii, for example, or wished for Nick and June, Rebel Nick and June, for example, and given it to Luke, either simply to hurt that part of the fandom, or to try to get us to switch teams, or maybe both. Instead of making Nick and Maid a rebel and staying true to Margaret Atwood's brilliant original book, they decided to torture him instead. I can't imagine how depressing it must have been for Max to read his script season after season. One might think with all the fans he brought in, he might be given more screen time or a better storyline eventually, and we held out hope that season 6 would be that season for him. But instead, each season just got worse and worse as it seems they tried to make the fans turn on Nick. For financial reasons alone, this baffles me. Look at any show Instagram post and you'll see that the majority of fans, by far, are drawn in by the Nick and June storyline. And we're talking numbers like 80 to 90%, not a slight majority by any means. In all honesty, I don't think any of us in this group would have stuck around without that storyline, purely because it's such a dark and depressing show that without that light to overcome the darkness from time to time, it would just be too painful to watch, especially while the real world around us became bleaker and bleaker. But for our group, all this episode is doing is assassinating June's character. Audiences have long grown tired of June's selfishness and savior complex. We've tried so hard to give June the benefit of the doubt as much as possible every season, but especially this season, even as she tells the Mayday leader, Moira can't do this, or tells Luke he can't do that, we've tried to hang on to the feelings she inspired in us the first 2 seasons. But if she won't give Nick, the man who saved her life countless times, and now her husband's and her best friend's only days ago, if she can't give him an ounce of the grace she gives actual Gilead founders Serena and Lawrence even, then that's the last straw. For us. Loyalty in a person or character is important to us, and I find the fact that June hasn't been romantically loyal to either Luke or Nick fairly gross at this point. Certainly very disappointing, but I had stupidly assumed that no matter what, the overarching loyalty to both of her baby's fathers and their safety was something that would be guaranteed forever, and I was apparently mistaken in that hope. Clearly, it's only Luke and Serena she cares about or feels any loyalty towards, which I find absolutely insane at this point. After 6 years of Nick devoting his whole life to her and risking his time and again to save hers, this is how she repays him? Never mind he didn't even betray her. He could have, and he didn't. When Wharton cornered Nick in the last episode, he had to give up something that would explain not only his Jezebel's visit, but also that he's clearly responsible for killing the 2 guardians from the water park. And a guardian was killed at Jezebel's this night, too. So Nick did have a huge blinking betray June option in front of him. Tell Wharton that June Osborne is outside right now and the reason for every one of those killings. He chose not to smash that betray June button and went with the plan that was a week away instead, a textbook page out of Double Agency 101. You have to play both sides and occasionally give the bad guys something real to keep them trusting you. And Wharton's trust was about at a half a ply of thinness, as we saw, but this worked and renewed it. And as Nick said, he had no idea what Wharton would do, and what Wharton did is on Wharton's head. The show showed us the brutal scene, again in the efforts of making us hate Nick, but in reality, as we'll discuss later, June's done similar things, we just haven't been forced to look at the carnage. And it's awful what happened, and you can see that Nick is absolutely hating himself and blaming himself for it. Anyway, on to this episode. I've read many times that one of the cardinal rules of television writing is show, don't tell. To have nearly an entire episode of television this late in the game devoted to all these side characters telling us how we're supposed to feel about Nick doesn't feel like what they meant by that. 4 characters are telling us we're supposed to now think Nick is a big bad Gilead commander and has always been untrustworthy? Because what we've seen on screen is quite literally the opposite. As Kira Snyder, the writer of Nick's flashback episode, replied to Marigold in a tweet about our analysis of that episode, all us writers were really interested in exploring how everyday people get pulled into movements like this, especially someone with a good heart. A man, that was in all caps by the way, with a good heart. Because from the get-go, Nick has had a good heart. He was trying to take care of his unemployed father and alcoholic brother when he got a job driving Sons of Jacob people around. Because Price promised him they would be flexible with his hours. All Nick has wanted his entire life is to take care of the people he loves. And now we learn that not a single person loves him back. He was not one of the Commander Lawrence or Serena Waterford types pre-Gilead who had grand plans for a better world without women at the helm, and designed the attack on America to get that done. No, Nick was a driver. Serena and Fred designed the attack on America. Sure, at some point, he likely overheard some shit that would have made him realize he should get the fuck out of there, but often by the time that happens, they won't let you leave, so he kept his head down and survived. We're not saying he never made bad choices. So anyway, he was a driver before the Gilead takeover, and then when June meets him, years later, this is how she describes him to us. He's the commander's driver, lives over the garage, low status, hasn't even been issued a woman. Wow, so he's still just a driver years later. I won't detail everything he's done since then, though I'm sure plenty of it will come out in this episode, but none of it is the untrustworthy Gilead commander bullshit that they're trying to feed us. He got 3 promotions that I'm aware of since he's been in Gilead, only one that he actually sought for himself. That one was when he asked to become an eye after he saw the Waterford's first handmaid hang herself from her chandelier, because he wanted to report on commanders, not handmaids. He wanted to report on commanders, and he started by taking down Commander Guthrie's, the commander who dreamt up the handmaid system. Nick did that directly in retribution for the first Waterford handmaid, who Fred and Serena had driven to suicide. It was too late to save her, but he could punish one of the men that drove her to it, and continue spying on Fred Waterford, one of the other commanders that were responsible for her death. So there's a very good deed Nick did long before June, for the record. The second of the 3 quote-unquote promotions, they called giving him a wife, Eden, a promotion. But in actuality, it was a uniquely cruel punishment dreamt up by Serena when Nick asked her to please take June to a mental health doctor after she had seen Omar on the wall and disappeared into herself. Nick was so concerned about June that he asked Serena for a fucking therapist, knowing what a dangerous thing he was doing, but loving June more than he cared for his own consequences. And you all probably remember Serena was quite mean to June for most of the show, but I bet many of you forgot the depths of her evil. She married Nick to a child in punishment for his concern for June, and just to further hurt her very sick pregnant handmaid. It's not hard to imagine why the last one killed herself, but it still managed to shock me that Serena was willing to risk the baby she wanted so badly, just because she hated that Nick cared about June that much. And lastly, the third of 3 promotions Nick has received in his years in Gilead. He was promoted to commander after he held Fred at gunpoint all night during June and Holly's escape. He held him at gunpoint in June's room, knowing that this was his one chance to use his life to free theirs. He knew he would end up on the wall afterwards. He didn't even try to escape. And instead, Fred punished him by making him a commander, knowing Nick would hate that and it would remove him from the picture, without Fred having to admit to anyone what had actually happened, that his driver had gotten the better of him and his handmaid had tried to escape. And his whole household had helped June. So there are the 3 big bad rungs of the ladder Nick has climbed in Gilead. Lawrence, on the other hand, has just become a high commander now. Anyway, we'll talk more about Lawrence and of course Nick throughout the episode, but I just wanted to touch a few key points of Nick's history first, in case anyone forgot his backstory. Lastly, and I am very sorry for how long this soliloquy is going on, and we're going to get into the details of the episode, but lastly, I want to say one more thing. To our listeners who care for Nick and June. I know people have been and are going to continue to come out and say Nick fans don't get the point of the show. It's not a love story and we're just a bunch of silly, naive fangirls. It seemed like some of the seeds of that were being planted in this episode, with multiple references to how hot Nick is. So let me explain something we've spent years repeating, that Nick's physical attractiveness has nothing to do with the reason we love his character. Women are not as simple and shallow as you're making them out to be. This group, for instance, is not a bunch of teenage fangirls. We are women in our 30s and 40s, many of us moms, with careers like doctors, wealth managers, professors, and more in industries that are as varied as the locations from which we come from all around the world. Same as our listeners. And to our listeners, please take this next part to heart. No matter how someone may try to shame you, it is not anti-feminist to believe in and care about romantic love. Our protagonist herself has said many times it is for love that she lives. Love is empowering, and we thought that was a message that the show understood. The show writers could have written Nick as a rebel, like Margaret Atwood did in the source material. Max would have been amazing in that role, and it would have gone to show that we need male allies in feminism. He is, after all, the male character who has supported and facilitated our female protagonist's agency more than anyone else in the show. No matter how idiotic what she wanted to do was, he was there to help her reach her goals, killing Fred, for instance, and try to keep her alive. Handmaids also could have simply leaned into the incredible chemistry, love, and the following that Nick and June have, and gone down in television history forever for having landed the best romance in television. In addition to capturing these wonderful relationships between all the women on the show. Because much like in life, it's not mutually exclusive. You can and should cultivate a life with wonderful friends like Janine and Moira, and also someone you love romantically who loves you back, if you're so lucky. It's not an either or. And again, I cannot say this enough, it is not a weakness or a character flaw in the viewers for appreciating it. People will feed you this line and try to belittle you, but do not let the bastards grind you down. I'd rather be a person who appreciates the beauty in all of these different types of relationships than someone who treats romantic love as naive and silly. You know who else thought romantic love was naive and silly? Our old friend Fred Waterford, may he rest in peace.